Everyone in the room feared him. But the only woman who couldn't even hear his voice. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Seo Global Holdings was the kind of room that made grown men forget how to breathe because of the man standing at the head of the long obsidian table. Seo Jung-ho didn't raise his voice. He never had to. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching BM-soo fumble through a slide presentation that should have taken 10 minutes and was now crawling into its 23rd. The numbers were wrong. The projections were optimistic to the point of delusion. And BM-soo, senior executive, 15 years with the company, was sweating through his collar like a man standing before a firing squad. Slide 12, Jung-ho said quietly. BM-soo clicked forward. Read the third column. Out loud. BM-soo read it. His voice cracked once in the middle. Jung-ho let the silence that followed stretch for exactly 5 seconds. Then he said, "Do you think incompetence sounds better when you say it slowly?" No one laughed. No one moved. 8 executives sat around that table with their eyes fixed on the surface in front of them, and not a single one of them breathed loud enough to be noticed. This was the rhythm of life inside Seo Global. You learned it fast or you didn't last. BM-soo's hands were shaking on the remote. Jung-ho turned away from him, which was somehow worse than continuing to look, and walked toward the window. Seoul stretched out below, gray and gleaming, enormous and indifferent, and he studied it the way he studied everything. Like it owed him something. Then the door opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. No heels clicking. No perfume announcing itself before she arrived. The door simply opened, and Lasha Williams walked in carrying a leather folio and wearing the expression of someone who had somewhere more interesting to be. She was unhurried. Completely, almost frustratingly unhurried. Every eye in the room went to her. She didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't care. She found an empty seat along the side wall, set her folio down, and only then looked up. Her eyes found Jung-ho immediately. She watched his lips. And she waited. And Seo Jung-ho, for the first time in longer than he could remember, paused. He didn't know why. He would spend a considerable amount of time later insisting, to himself, that it meant nothing. That he simply hadn't expected the interruption. That it was a standard pause. Completely unremarkable. But the executives noticed. And Yara, his assistant, standing near the door with her tablet, noticed. And she pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. If you're already feeling something about this story, good. Stay with it. Hit that like button and subscribe, because it only gets deeper from here. Lasha Williams had lived in Seoul for 4 years, and in that time she had learned 3 things about the city. The subway was magnificent. The food would ruin you for every other cuisine. And Koreans had a very specific expression they made when they first realized she was deaf. A quick recalibration. A split second of not knowing what to do. Some people overcorrected into exaggerated warmth. Some people simply looked away. Lasha had learned to clock it in under 2 seconds and move on. She was 31, originally from Atlanta, and she had been a professional interpreter since she was 24. She worked in both ASL and Korean Sign Language, sometimes simultaneously, and she had a gift that went beyond technical skill. She could read a room. Not just lips, the whole room. The tension in someone's shoulders. The way a person's eyes moved before they said something they didn't mean. The pause before a lie. It made her exceptional at her job. It also made her very difficult to fool. Her assignment to Seo Global Holdings had come through Yara, who had contacted her agency 2 days before with a blunt briefing. International negotiations, real-time interpretation required, duration uncertain. The rate was good. The client was described, with almost comedic understatement, as results-oriented. Lasha had done her research. She knew exactly who Seo Jung-ho was before she walked into that boardroom. She had read 3 articles, skimmed a profile in a business magazine, and watched 4 minutes of a conference appearance on mute, just watching his face, his hands, the way he held himself. She formed her opinion quickly and filed it away. What she didn't expect was the pause. She'd watched him cut through a senior executive like it required no more effort than signing a check, and then he'd turned and seen her and something had moved behind his eyes. Not softness. Nothing as simple as that. More like recalibration. The same expression everyone else made, but slower. More deliberate. She filed that away too. After the boardroom cleared, Yara brought her to Jung-ho's office. It was enormous and aggressively minimalist. One wall of windows. A desk the size of a small boat. No personal photographs. No clutter of any kind. Just clean lines and the faint smell of expensive coffee. Jung-ho was standing when she entered. He didn't sit. He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding something, then said, "You're the interpreter." She nodded. He clasped his hands. "I don't need a filter. I need accuracy." She picked up the small notepad she kept for initial meetings with new clients and wrote, "That's not how interpretation works. Accuracy includes context." He read it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I speak clearly. I speak precisely. I don't need someone deciding which of my words are appropriate for the room." She wrote, "You need someone who understands what you're actually trying to accomplish. Then I can help." He stared at what she'd written. Then he looked up at her, and she held his gaze without any performance, no defiance, no apology, just simple steadiness, and he made a sound that might have been the beginning of a response and then stopped. "Tomorrow," he said finally. 9 o'clock. "We have a preliminary meeting with the park group delegation." She nodded once and left. He stood at his desk for a moment after she was gone, looking at the notepad she'd written on. He hadn't offered her a seat. He suddenly noticed that, the way you notice a small error in a column of numbers. He pushed it aside. It didn't matter. The park group delegation arrived at 9:02, which Jung-ho clocked and filed away as a minor power move. There were 4 of them. 2 executives, a legal advisor, and an older gentleman named Chairman Park Dae-won who said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes and watched everything. Lasha sat slightly to Jung-ho's left. Close enough to be visible to everyone at the table, far enough not to crowd him. He had tested her in his office. Now, in the actual meeting, he watched her peripherally the way he watched everything constantly, without appearing to. She was precise. Faster than he expected. When he spoke, her hands moved with a fluency that turned his words into something else entirely, not different words, but the same words given shape and dimension and weight. She wasn't decorating his language. She was conducting it. And then, 40 minutes in, he said something that he'd said 100 times before in negotiations. A pointed observation about the other party's timeline, technically accurate, strategically calculated to apply pressure, exactly the kind of remark that made boardrooms tilt in his direction. Lasha paused. It was half a second. Maybe less. But he noticed it. Her hands moved. The park group delegation exchanged a glance. Then Chairman Park Dae-won, who had said almost nothing, uncrossed his arms and leaned slightly forward. And the conversation shifted, opened up rather than contracting, and 20 minutes later, when the preliminary framework was agreed and the delegation was gathering their things, everyone in the room understood that something significant had just been accomplished. Jung-ho waited until the last delegate was through the door. Then he turned to Lasha and said, very quietly, "You changed my words." She didn't look away from him. She signed, and Yara, who had been learning to interpret basic exchanges, said carefully, she says, "I corrected your intention." The silence in the room was different from the silence in the boardroom that morning. This one had texture. "My intention," he repeated, "was to apply pressure." Lasha signed again. Yara translated, "Your intention was to close this deal. Pressure would have ended it." Jung-ho looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Yara quietly moved toward the door to give them the illusion of privacy. He didn't respond. He turned and walked to his desk. But that line, "I corrected your intention," he couldn't put it down. It followed him through 3 more meetings and a conference call and a dinner he attended and didn't taste, and it was still sitting in the back of his mind when he finally drove home at 11:15. He didn't like that. He didn't like things that stayed with him uninvited. He kept requesting her. That was the part that Yara found fascinating. She had worked for Seo Jung-ho for 6 years. She had watched him cycle through 3 executive assistants, 2 chief officers, and 1 entire communications department. He didn't keep things that didn't serve him at maximum efficiency. And yet, 3 days after Lasha Williams walked into that boardroom, He had specifically requested her for the Hanmi group call, and then for the Singapore delegation, and then for the internal leadership meeting, which technically didn't require any interpretation at all. And when Yara pointed this out, Jung-ho told her to mind the calendar and not the reasoning behind it. Yara minded the calendar, but she also noticed that he had started speaking more slowly. Not dramatically, just by a fraction. Just enough that someone watching his lips would have a slightly easier time reading them. He hadn't mentioned it. He probably didn't know he was doing it. She didn't mention it either. In the meetings themselves, the dynamic between them was strange and fascinating and occasionally alarming. Lasha didn't defer to him. She was professional, precise, always professional, but she treated him with a kind of level-eyed equality that no one else in the building came close to approximating. She didn't jump when he shifted tone. She didn't hurry when he moved fast. She simply held her own ground with the calm certainty of someone who had decided, a long time ago, exactly where her ground was. It drove him crazy. The first big clash came during a meeting with a potential European partner. Jung-ho had been managing the negotiation tightly, controlling the pace and the emotional temperature with the expertise of someone who had been doing it for 20 years. And then the lead from the European side said something conciliatory, something that was clearly an olive branch, and Jung-ho responded with a remark so sharp it could have cut glass. Lasha stopped signing. The European team looked at her. She signed a response, significantly softer than what Jung-ho had said, then held up one finger toward the European side, turned to Jung-ho, and signed something directly at him. No notepad. No intermediary. He couldn't read it. He stared at her hands. She waited. Then she picked up her notepad and wrote, in clear capital letters, "What are you doing?" He stared at that for a full 3 seconds. Then he looked at the European team, adjusted his posture, and said, in a tone that Lasha suspected cost him something real, "What I meant to say is that we appreciate the flexibility your team has shown. Let's explore that middle ground." The meeting survived. The partnership moved forward. Afterward, when the room had cleared, he pointed at her and said, "You are here to translate." Nothing more. She signed clearly and deliberately. Yara translated, "You don't listen. That's why people fear you, not respect you." The room was empty except for the three of them, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the city beyond the glass. Jung-ho stared at Lasha. Lasha looked back at him, completely calm. Like she was waiting to see what he did with the truth now that she'd handed it to him. He turned and walked out. The problem, and Jung-ho was extremely reluctant to identify it as a problem, but eventually intellectual honesty required it, was that he kept thinking about what she said. Not replaying the specific words exactly. More like carrying the weight of them without knowing where to set it down. Yara noticed he was distracted during a Thursday morning briefing. He noticed that he was distracted during the briefing and became annoyed at himself for being noticeable. He started paying attention to the way she signed. Not to understand, he didn't know sign language, but to read the rhythm of it, the way he might study someone's speaking pattern to better understand them. He watched her hands in meetings and tried to parse what certain movements meant. He got some of them wrong and some of them he thought right. He looked up the Korean Sign Language alphabet on his phone at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and then immediately put the phone face down and sat very still for a moment, confronting what he was doing. He was not doing anything, he decided. He was simply ensuring thorough professional understanding of the communication tools being used in his company. That was all. The next morning, in his apartment, he practiced spelling his own name in sign. Lash, no, wait. That was her name. He started again. Jung Cho. Yara walked in with his morning briefing files. He immediately straightened up and rolled both shoulders back in a slow, deliberate motion and looked at her with absolute composure. "Good morning," he said. Yara looked at his hands, then at his face, then back at his hands. "Were you stretching?" "Yes," he said. "Both hands at once?" "It's a specific technique," he said. "The files." She handed him the files. She did not smile until she was back in the hallway. He saw her on a Thursday evening. He had left the office late, unusual. He normally stayed until at least 9, but there was a tension behind his eyes that the building's climate control wasn't helping, and he decided, without examining the decision too carefully, to take a different route to his car. The different route took him past a community center 3 blocks from Seo Global's building. He almost didn't stop. But through the wide front windows, movement caught his eye. There were children inside, 8, maybe 10 of them, ages ranging from perhaps 6 to 12. They were sitting in a circle on colorful mats, and in the center of the circle was Lasha. She looked nothing like the woman who sat across from him in boardrooms. Her jacket was gone. She was in a simple blouse with the sleeves pushed up, and she was signing something that made the children erupt into laughter, delighted and uninhibited, the kind of laughter that belongs only to children who feel completely safe. One small boy in the front row was laughing so hard he was leaning into the girl beside him. A girl in the back was signing something back at Lasha with the exaggerated drama of a much-practiced storyteller. Lasha responded with equal drama, and the circle dissolved again into laughter. Then a small girl, maybe 7 years old, stood up and walked straight to Lasha with her arms already extended, and Lasha gathered her in with the ease of someone for whom warmth required no preparation. The child hugged her and then leaned back to sign something with a very serious expression. Lasha signed back with equal seriousness and then broke into a smile, so wide it changed the whole shape of her face. Jung-ho stood on the pavement outside and watched. He stood there for longer than he intended. Long enough that a man walking past gave him a mildly concerned look, and he straightened up and moved on. He sat in the back of his car on the way home and looked out the window at the city and felt something that he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't envy exactly. It wasn't longing, though it touched that at one edge. It was more like distance. The sudden awareness of how far he was from something real, something warm, something that laughed without calculating what the laughter might cost. He didn't examine it too carefully. He was very good at not examining things too carefully. The interactions between them were shifting, and he couldn't stop it. In meetings, he found himself angling his body slightly toward her when he spoke, not for her benefit, he told himself, but because she gave him the most accurate read of how his words were landing. In the hallways, when they passed each other, she nodded. He nodded back. Once she said something with her hands, and he didn't have a translator present, and he stared at her hands for a moment, and then looked at her face, and she raised an eyebrow and pulled out her phone and typed, "You have a coffee stain on your collar." He had looked down. He had. "Thank you," he said, which was not something he said with any regularity. She'd put her phone away and kept walking. There was one moment, during a late negotiation session that ran past 8 in the evening, when he was going through the revised contract terms and she was translating in real time, and he reached across the table for the same document she'd just picked up. Their fingers didn't touch. They nearly did, and then didn't, and they both froze for exactly 1 second, as if some signal had fired simultaneously in 2 different nervous systems. He withdrew his hand. She set the document down. He picked it up and continued without looking at her. That night he went home and stood in his kitchen for 10 minutes without making the tea he'd ostensibly gone in there to make. He was annoyed. At himself, specifically. He wasn't entirely sure what for. He found out about it on a Friday morning. Yara brought him a file, background documentation on the international deal partners, cross-referenced contacts, standard due diligence material, and buried in one of the attached records was a photograph. A charity event from 7 years ago. A company he used to work for before he built Seo Global from nothing. A fundraiser for a deaf accessibility program. And in the photograph, in the background, wearing a blue dress and maybe 24 years old, was Lasha Williams. He stared at the photograph. He thought about the community center. About the way she had looked at him that first morning in the boardroom, not like a stranger, but like someone confirming something they already knew. The absence of surprise in her eyes. He brought the photograph to Yara. "Do you know about this?" Yara looked at it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she mentioned, very briefly, when I first contacted her agency, that she had some indirect familiarity with the company. I assumed she meant professionally. She was at a company event. 7 years ago. I see that. He looked at the photograph again. The fundraiser. He had been there. He didn't remember much about it. It had been one of dozens of obligatory appearances from that year, before everything changed, before he made the choices that turned him into who he was now. Before the company he'd trusted had collapsed around him and taken everything and left him with nothing but the certainty that he would rebuild, and it would be on his own terms, and he would never again let anyone else hold the architecture of his ambitions. He didn't remember the fundraiser, but he remembered the feeling of that year. The person he'd been. The version of himself that hadn't yet learned what it cost to be soft. She'd seen him then. Whoever he had been in that room at that event, she had seen him. And that, he understood suddenly, was why she wasn't afraid of him. Because she already knew what he looked like before he built the walls. He set the photograph down on his desk and stood very still. He didn't go to her about it. He filed it away in the part of himself where he put things that required more time than he currently had, and he went into the next meeting, and the meeting after that, and he told himself that it didn't change anything. It changed everything. The Lim Corporation deal was the largest of the year. Possibly the largest of the decade. The negotiations had been building for 8 months, and the final round of talks was scheduled across 3 days with delegations from 4 countries and a contract value that had 7 zeros attached to it. Jung-ho went in like he always did, controlled, precise, ready. And then the pressure started climbing. It was day 2 when things began to fracture. The Indonesian delegation had concerns about a subsidiary clause that the legal team had flagged as a potential problem weeks earlier, and that Jung-ho had decided to manage in the room rather than address beforehand. A calculated risk that was, by mid-afternoon, looking increasingly miscalculated. He could feel the deal slipping. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in the small ways he recognized. The Indonesian lead stopping making eye contact, the body language around the table going flat, conversations becoming more careful. He did what he always did when pressure rose. He tightened. He cut Lasha off mid-translation to restate a point himself. She stopped, hands still. He overrode a nuanced exchange with a direct statement that stripped away all the context she'd carefully been building. She looked at him. He looked back, and something in his eyes said, "Not now. Translate." Nothing more. She translated. The Indonesian lead nodded without warmth. The day ended without resolution. The deal was still alive, but barely, the way a conversation is still alive when everyone in it has stopped being honest. That evening, after the delegations had gone and the conference rooms were being cleared, Jung-ho found Lasha in the corridor gathering her things. He walked toward her with the specific energy of a man who is angry and has decided that moving the anger outward is easier than sitting with it. "The subsidiary clause," he said. "I need you to understand that in tomorrow's session, your role is literal translation. I don't need interpretation. I need precision." She looked at him. Her hands were still. She waited a beat, one beat, then signed. She didn't have Yara with her. She went to her phone, typed fast, turned it to face him. "You think power means control, but you're just afraid to feel anything." He read it. The corridor was empty. The lights were the low, efficient lighting of after hours, and it made everything look slightly too real. He read it twice. Then he said, "You're done. Effective immediately. Yara will process." She turned and walked away before he finished the sentence. He stood in the empty corridor. The words on her phone screen were still burning somewhere behind his eyes. He walked to his office and sat down and stared at his desk for a while. Then he told himself he'd made the right call. He told himself this approximately 47 times over the next 4 days. The meeting with the German partners on Monday was a disaster. Not immediately. The first 20 minutes were fine, surface-level, pleasantries, no real substance. But when it moved into the details, when the German legal representative began asking questions about the subsidiary structure, the room needed nuance. It needed someone who could read when a question was an obstacle and when it was an invitation. It needed a translator who understood that translation was not a word-for-word relay, but a bridge between 2 different ways of making meaning. The interpreter the agency sent was technically proficient. He had nothing else. By the 40-minute mark, The German representative was frowning. By the hour mark, the meeting had been politely suspended for further documentation review, which was a diplomatic way of saying nothing had been accomplished. The Lim deal was now in formal jeopardy. Soo, who had apparently been waiting for a moment to stop shaking, came to Jung-ho's office on Tuesday with a memo from 3 of the senior partners expressing concern about the direction of negotiations. He delivered it quietly, with the careful caution of someone reaching through a tiger's cage, but he delivered it. A week earlier, Jung-ho would have silenced him with a look. Instead, he took the memo and read it and put it on his desk and said nothing. Yara was quieter than usual. She did her job exactly as she always did, but the warmth she had started to allow herself around him, small things, a dry comment here, a raised eyebrow there, was gone. She was professional and nothing more. He noticed. He noticed all of it. He sat in the company he had built, in the office at the center of it, and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives after you've lost something significant, that he had not lost a translator. He had lost the one person who had told him the truth without arming themselves first. The clarity didn't feel like power. It felt like a room with no windows. The 3rd day after the German meeting, he got the call. The Lim Corporation deal, all 3 years of groundwork, all 8 months of negotiations, all 7 zeros of it, had been formally suspended pending restructuring. The Indonesian delegation had withdrawn their preliminary agreement. The other partners were watching and waiting. He was in the conference room when the call ended. He set the phone down on the table. The other executives around him were carefully not looking at him, which was the usual response to his moods, and for the first time that instinct in them made him feel not powerful but profoundly, specifically alone. He thought about Lasha in that community center. The small girl who ran to her with her arms already extended. The laughter that required no translation. He thought about a photograph from 7 years ago, and a version of himself he barely remembered, and a woman who had recognized something in that version worth knowing. He stood up. "Clear my afternoon," he said. Yara looked up. "All of it. All of it." He left without his jacket. He didn't have her address. He had her agency's contact information and, after 6 minutes of a conversation with the receptionist that required him to use a tone of voice he almost never used, patient, slightly apologetic, genuinely uncertain. He had the name of the community center and an assurance that she was usually there on Thursday afternoons. It was a Thursday. He stood outside the community center on the pavement and felt the specific discomfort of a man who has been in control of every room he has ever entered, now standing outside a room he wasn't sure he had the right to enter at all. He went in. The children's session had ended. The space was being cleaned up, mats stacked, chairs arranged. Lasha was at the far end of the room, crouching down to pick up a small bag someone had left behind, and she turned at the movement of the door and saw him standing there. She stood up slowly. She didn't move toward him. She didn't move away. She simply stood and waited. In that way she had, like someone who had decided a long time ago that the world could come to her. He crossed the room. He stopped a few feet from her. He was aware, in a way he was almost never aware of himself, of how he was standing. No jacket. No posture of authority. Just himself, slightly uncertain, in a community center that smelled like chalk and cleaning solution. He started to speak. A whole sentence prepared, beginning with, "I've reconsidered the professional arrangement and believe that." He stopped. He looked at her. She raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "Go on," the eyebrow said. "If you're going to say something real, say it." He took a breath. And slowly, incorrectly, in the clumsy, imprecise movement of someone who had been practicing alone in an apartment at midnight, he signed. Wrong. It was technically 2 words. It wasn't elegant. His form was off and his hand shape on the second word was almost certainly not right. But it was unmistakably an attempt, and it was unmistakably real, and Lasha looked at his hands, and then looked at his face, and everything about her stilled. He held the silence. She signed back. Slowly. Clearly. She made sure he could follow. He couldn't follow all of it. But Yara, who had apparently followed him and was standing in the doorway pretending to look at her phone, translated quietly, "I remembered you." Because you were the only one who treated me like I wasn't broken." He stood very still. 7 years ago, at a charity event he barely remembered, he had apparently done something worthy of being remembered. He didn't know exactly what. Some small decency, some ordinary human moment, in the middle of a year when he was still capable of those without thinking about what they cost. He thought about who he'd been then and who he'd chosen to become and the long distance between the 2 points, and he understood that she had been carrying a version of him across all that distance, a version he'd abandoned. And that she'd walked into his boardroom already knowing it was still in there somewhere, buried under all the control and the precision and the walls. She'd been right. He didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure language covered it. But she was looking at him with something that wasn't quite a smile yet, something softer, more tentative, more real than a smile, the way the sky looks about 30 seconds before it shifts from gray to gold. And he thought that maybe for once in his life he didn't need to find the exact right words. He signed again. Badly. Slowly. One clumsy shape at a time. I am learning. She watched his hands. Then she looked up at his face. And this time the almost smile became actual, quiet, warm, the same kind of warmth he'd seen through a window on a Thursday evening that he hadn't been able to put down since. "Okay," she said. Out loud. Her voice, which he had never heard before, was lower than he'd expected and slightly rough and completely her own. He blinked. She tapped her own throat once and signed something. Yara translated, "I can speak. I just choose not to in rooms full of people who only listen to what they want to hear." He felt something in his chest that he was fairly certain was the last wall doing something structures are not supposed to do. "That's fair," he said. Seo Global Holdings was different after that. Not overnight. Not in some dramatic reinvention that announced itself with a press release. But gradually, in the way that real change always works, in the specific small moments that add up without fanfare. Jung-ho started listening in meetings before he spoke. Not performing listening, but actually absorbing what was in the room before deciding how to respond to it. His sentences shortened. His silences lengthened in a different way, not cold, but considered. His executives noticed first that he was harder to predict and then, slowly, that the unpredictability no longer felt dangerous. Soo, who had aged approximately 3 years and 12 months, found himself in a meeting where Jung-ho said, "Walk me through the 3rd column. I want to understand your reasoning," and realized he was being asked a question, not backed against a wall. His hands steadied. His voice steadied. By the end of the quarter, he had led the most successful regional expansion the company had seen in 5 years. Yara got her warmth back. It took about 3 weeks. She allowed herself one dry comment on a Tuesday, gauged the response, and by the following Monday had graduated back to the raised eyebrow. She also, quietly, began taking Korean Sign Language classes on Tuesday evenings. She didn't mention it to anyone. The Lim Corporation deal was restructured and, over the following 6 weeks, painstakingly rebuilt from the subsidiary clause up. It was slower. It required compromise that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. But it closed. And when it did, it was the kind of agreement that both sides actually trusted, because it had been built on something real. Lasha came back. Not with a contract revision or a formal reinstatement. She simply arrived on a Monday morning, nodded to Yara, and took her usual chair slightly to the left of the head of the table. Jung-ho, who was in the middle of something, looked up and saw her and stopped speaking for exactly 1 second. Then he continued what he was saying, and she picked up her folio, and the room went on. But everyone in it understood, without anyone saying so, that something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't his translator. She wasn't his employee, in the way that word had always felt in this building something owned, something instrumental, something deployed. She was present in the room the way an equal is present, fully, without apology, with the specific authority of someone who has decided where her ground is and has no intention of moving off it. He began learning sign language in earnest. 3 sessions a week with an instructor Yara found, plus the unofficial practice that happened when Lasha was nearby and patient enough to correct his form. He was not a natural. He was too accustomed to precision, too conscious of doing it correctly, too reluctant to look incompetent in the process of learning. She found this genuinely funny, and she let him see that she found it funny, and eventually he learned to let himself be bad at something in front of her without it costing him anything. That was, as it turned out, the hardest thing. Harder than restructuring a billion-dollar deal. Harder than rebuilding a company from the ash of a collapse. Harder than any negotiation he had ever sat across from. Learning to be uncertain in front of someone and letting them stay anyway. He got there. Imperfectly. Slowly. In the clumsy, real way of a person learning something that doesn't come naturally, and doing it because the point on the horizon is worth the work. And she stayed. Not because he was reformed, not because he was fixed, not because he had become someone unrecognizable, but because the man from that photograph 7 years ago, the one who had done something decent without an audience, without a calculation, without a wall, was still in there. Still reachable. She had known that before he did. And that, maybe, was the truest kind of translation, to see what someone means before they know how to say it, and hold it carefully until they find the words. In a world where power was measured by fear, she taught him the strength of being understood. If this story touched you, wait until you see what happens when love speaks louder than words. Check out the next story on this channel. Thanks for watching. See you in the next.